I was working security at Frankfurt Airport when an American woman marched up to my desk holding her boarding pass like it was a subpoena. She pointed at the gate number and said, "This says B42. Where's that?" I pointed to the giant sign 15 feet above her head that said, "Gates B1, B50, with an arrow. She looked up, looked back at me and said, "But where exactly is B42? You're already seeing the pattern most travelers miss." And this channel exists to decode that mindset in real time. I track this full time so you don't have to. If you value depth over mockery, this is where you stay sharp. Subscribe and stay ahead of the next culture clash. I told her to follow the signs with the letter B. She frowned and said, "You guys should really make this easier to understand." That was a Tuesday. On Wednesday, a man asked me why his flight to Ibiza was listed under Ibiza. He'd been saying it wrong for so long that he genuinely thought the airport had misspelled it. When I explained the correct pronunciation, he said, "Well, that's confusing. They should change it." I just nodded. You learn not to argue. By Thursday, I'd watched someone try to board a flight to Vienna, thinking they were going to Venice. They had the wrong boarding pass, wrong gate, wrong country. When we caught it, they said, "But they both start with V." My colleague had to pull up a map. They were two different nations. The passenger looked at the screen and said, "Europe is smaller than I thought." We missed our break that day. Friday was peak season. A family arrived 4 hours early but spent 3 of those hours at a restaurant outside security. When they finally came through, they had 30 minutes to make their flight. They were upset we didn't warn them. I asked if they'd seen the signs that said, "Allow 90 minutes for security." The dad said, "We thought that was a suggestion." Their flight left without them. They asked if we could call it back. The weekends were somehow worse. A couple once asked me if they needed a passport to fly to Paris. I said yes. They asked why. I explained it was a different country. The woman said, "But we're in Europe." I said, "You're in Germany." She said, "Same thing, right?" I pulled up a map again. This happens more than you'd think. Another guy tried to go through security with a full-sized bottle of bourbon. When we stopped him, he said, "It's sealed." I explained the liquid limit. He said, "This cost $60. I told him he could check it or throw it away. He opened it and started chugging. We had to escort him out. He never made his flight either. Then there was the man who argued with the gate agent because his ticket said 1424 thwards, and he thought that meant 220 a.m. He'd shown up 12 hours early and was mad about it. When she explained military time, he said, "Why don't you just use normal time?" She said, "This is normal time in most of the world." He asked to speak to a manager. I'm not making these up. I've worked at 3 major European airports. Every single day, there's a new story. And they almost always involve the same confusion, the same confidence, the same shock when things don't work like they do back home. My first week on the job, I learned that Americans treat airport security like a debate club. A man once argued with me for 10 minutes about why he couldn't bring his hunting knife on the plane. He said, "It's a tool, not a weapon." I said it was a 6-inch blade. He said, "But I'm not going to use it." I explained that intent doesn't change the rules. He said, "This is ridiculous. In Texas, I can carry this anywhere." I said, "We're in Amsterdam." He looked genuinely surprised, like he'd forgotten where he was. Another time, a woman tried to bring a snow globe through security. It was one of those big ones, easily 500 milliliters of liquid. When we stopped her, she said, "But it's not drinkable." I explained it doesn't matter. She unscrewed the top and took a sip to prove her point. It was glycerin and water. She immediately spit it out. We had to throw it away anyway. She filed a complaint about us wasting her property. The shoe thing always gets them. Every airport in Europe makes you take your shoes off. Every single time, someone acts like it's a personal attack. A businessman once said, I have pre-check. I said, that's an American program. He said, it should work everywhere. I explained that wasn't how international agreements work. He said, this is why nobody likes Europe. He was flying to London for vacation. Most channels just tell stories like this. I dissect why they happen. The psychology, the pattern, the cultural blind spot. If you caught that layer underneath the laugh, you're exactly the kind of person who should be here. Subscribe, because surface-level takes won't cut it anymore. Laptops are another battleground. A college student once refused to take his computer out of his bag. He said, I do this all the time at home. I said our scanners required it. He said, your technology must be outdated. I explained it was protocol. He rolled his eyes and yanked it out so hard he cracked the screen on the bin. Then he tried to blame us for making him rush. I've seen people try to bring full meals through security. Not snacks, entire rotisserie chickens, Tupperwares of spaghetti. A woman once had a Pyrex dish of lasagna in her carry-on. When we flagged it, she said, it's for my son in Barcelona. I said it wouldn't survive the X-ray screening without leaking. She said, just be careful with it. We explained we couldn't make exceptions. She insisted on carrying it on anyway. It exploded in the overhead bin at 30,000 feet. The flight attendants were not happy. Then there's the people who don't understand what empty your pockets means. A guy walked through the metal detector with his phone, wallet, keys, coins, a lighter, and a belt buckle the size of Texas. When it beeped, he looked confused. I asked if he'd emptied his pockets. He said, yeah. I asked him to try again. He pulled out a multi-tool, a pocket watch, and 3 lighters. The scanner beeped again. He'd forgotten about the metal plate in his jacket. He was genuinely baffled that metal sets off metal detectors. My coworker once stopped a woman who had 12 mini bottles of vodka in her purse. When asked about it, she said, they're under 100 milliliters each. Technically true, but she had 12 of them. I explained the overall liquid limit. She said, but they're individually compliant. I told her she could keep 1 quart-sized bag's worth. She said, I need all of them for the flight. We went back and forth. Eventually, she drank 4 of them right there at security and stuffed the rest in her bag. She barely made it to her gate. The belts are always a production. People act like unbuckling a belt is an Olympic event. A man once held up the entire line because he couldn't figure out how his belt worked. It was a normal belt. He'd been wearing it all day. But something about the pressure of security made him forget basic motor skills. He stood there wrestling with it for 3 minutes while 20 people waited behind him. When he finally got it off, he sighed like he'd summoned the strength of 1,000 ancestors. One family showed up with 6 carry-ons for 4 people. When we explained the limit, the dad said, we paid for our tickets. I said that doesn't change the bag policy. He said, this is a scam. I explained they could check the extra bags. He said, that costs money. I said yes. He said, you're just trying to squeeze us. I pointed to the policy printed on their boarding passes. He said, nobody reads those. They ended up leaving 2 bags at the airport and filing a complaint about theft. A businessman tried to skip the line because he had a meeting. I explained everyone had somewhere to be. He said, this is urgent. I said, so is everyone else's flight. He said, do you know who I am? I said, no. He said, exactly. Then he waited in line like everyone else. When he got to the front, he was perfectly polite. The posturing only works when there's distance. The absolute worst are the people who pack like they're moving abroad. A woman once had a carry-on so stuffed it wouldn't fit in the sizing bin. When we told her she'd need to check it, she said, it fit on my last flight. I said it wouldn't fit on this one. She said, can't you just let it slide? I explained physics doesn't negotiate. She unpacked half her bag right there at the gate and shoved items into her purse, her jacket pockets, and her husband's bag. They still missed boarding because she took 20 minutes. I switched to working the information desk after 2 years of security. I thought it would be calmer. I was wrong. A woman once came up to me in tears because she couldn't find her gate. I asked which one she needed. She said, "The one to Paris." I explained there were 6 flights to Paris that day. She said, "They didn't tell me which one." I asked to see her boarding pass. She didn't have it. She'd thrown it away after checking in because she thought she didn't need it anymore. We spent 40 minutes tracking down her flight through her email confirmation. She made it with 5 minutes to spare. Another guy asked me where the train station was. I pointed to the signs that said train station with arrows. He said, "No, I mean the real train station." I asked what he meant. He said, "The one that goes into the city." I explained that's what the arrows were pointing to. He said, "But this is an airport." I said yes, and the train connects to it. He looked at me like I'd invented a new form of transportation. He'd genuinely never heard of an airport train line. He thought he needed to take a taxi to a separate train station. When I explained it was downstairs, he asked if I was sure. I walked him to the escalator. Someone once asked me what time their 3 p.m. flight left. I said 3 p.m. They said, "No, in real time." I asked what they meant. They said, "Like afternoon or morning?" I said 3 p.m. is afternoon. They said, "How do I know for sure?" I showed them the boarding pass that said 15. They said, "See, that's what I mean." "What time is that?" I explained it's 3 p.m. They said, "Why don't they just write that?" I explained that most of the world uses a 24-hour clock. They walked away, shaking their head like I'd tried to scam them. A family approached me once asking if they needed visas to go to London. I asked where they were from. They said California. I explained that U.S. citizens don't need a visa for short visits, but do need a passport. The mom said, "We have passports." I said they should be fine then. She said, "But we're going to England." I said, "Yes, that's fine." She said, "Don't we need permission?" I realized she thought England was harder to enter than it is. I explained the visa waiver situation. She seemed skeptical but thanked me anyway. As they walked away, I heard her husband say, "I still think we should have called ahead." Then there was the man who asked me how to get to Terminal 2. I told him to follow the signs. He said, "I don't see any signs." I pointed directly at the sign 5 feet in front of him that said Terminal 2 in 3 languages with a giant arrow. He squinted at it and said, "That's not very clear." I asked what would make it clearer. He said, "Maybe write it in English." I said, "It is in English." He said, "Oh." Then he walked the opposite direction from the arrow. A couple once asked me if they could drink the water in Spain. I said yes. They seemed doubtful. The wife said, "But it's not America." I explained that Europe has clean drinking water. She said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. She said, "We heard it makes you sick." I asked where they heard that. She said, "The internet." I explained that was likely outdated or about a different region. She said, "Better safe than sorry," and bought 12 bottles of water for a 3-day trip. I once had someone ask me if people in Italy speak Italian. I said yes. They said, "Like everyone?" I said most people, yes. They said, "What if I only speak English?" I explained many people in tourist areas speak English, but it helps to learn basic phrases. They said, "That seems inconvenient." I didn't know how to respond to that. Another traveler asked me if they could use American dollars in Paris. I said they use euros. He said, "But dollars are more valuable." I explained currency doesn't work that way. He said, "Can't I just exchange it there?" I said, "Yes, but you'll get euros back." He said, "Why would I want euros?" I explained that's the currency in France. He said, "That's confusing." I suggested he visit a currency exchange before his trip. He said, "I'll just use my card." I said, "That works too." A woman approached me looking frantic. She said her flight was delayed and she'd miss her connection. I asked how long the delay was. She said 15 minutes. I explained that's a minor delay. She said, "But I only have 3 hours to connect." I said, that's plenty of time. She said, are you sure? I said, yes. She said, what if something goes wrong? I explained the airline would help her rebook if needed. She said, this is so stressful. Her connection was in the same terminal. Someone once asked me if they needed shots to go to Germany. I asked what they meant. They said, like vaccines. I said, not for Germany, no. They said, really? I said, yes. They said, isn't it a foreign country? I explained that doesn't automatically require vaccines. They said, huh? I thought you needed shots for everywhere. I asked if they were thinking of tropical regions. They said, maybe. They seemed disappointed they didn't need vaccines. My favorite was the man who asked if his phone would work in Europe. I said most smartphones work internationally with the right plan. He said, but Europe uses different electricity. I said, that's true for outlets, but phones are different. He said, how? I explained that cell towers operate on similar frequencies. He said, that doesn't sound right. I suggested he check with his carrier. He said, I'll just buy a new phone there. I didn't argue. Working the ticket counter is where you really see the entitlement. A man once demanded we refund his ticket because he missed his flight. I asked why he missed it. He said he didn't realize he needed to be there 2 hours early. I explained that's standard for international flights. He said, nobody told me. I pointed to the confirmation email that says it 3 times. He said, I don't read those. I explained we couldn't refund a missed flight due to late arrival. He said, this is theft. He'd been sent 5 reminder emails. A woman tried to check in 7 bags for a 1-week trip. When we explained the fee, she said, I'm not paying that. I said those are the airline's rates. She said, can't you just waive it? I explained I don't have that authority. She said, not even 1 bag? I said no. She said, what kind of customer service is this? I said the kind that follows policy. She paid the fee, but made sure everyone in line knew she was unhappy about it. Then there was the couple who showed up 10 minutes before boarding, ended, and were mad the gate was far away. The husband said, why is our gate all the way at the end? I explained gate assignments are based on aircraft positioning. He said, that's poor planning. I said it's a large airport. He said, you should have shuttles. I explained we have moving walkways and trains. He said, we shouldn't have to walk. They had 35 minutes before boarding closed. They made it fine. Someone once asked me to move their seat because they didn't like the person next to them. I asked if there was a safety issue. They said, no, I just don't want to sit there. I explained the flight was full. They said, can't you bump someone? I said no. They said, I paid for this ticket. I explained so did everyone else. They said, this is unacceptable. They sat in their assigned seat. A businessman demanded an upgrade because he flies frequently. I checked his account. He'd flown twice that year. I explained upgrades are based on availability and status. He said, I'm a loyal customer. I showed him his flight history. He said, I fly other airlines too. I explained that doesn't count for this airline's status. He said, that's a stupid system. I agreed to disagree. I once had a passenger ask me to hold the plane because they were running late. I explained we can't delay a flight for 1 person. They said, I'm 5 minutes away. I said boarding already closed. They said, just 5 minutes. I explained 200 other passengers were waiting. They said, they can wait 5 more minutes. I said no. They showed up 12 minutes later and were shocked the plane had left. Another traveler wanted a refund because they didn't like the food on their previous flight. I explained we don't handle catering complaints. They said, who does? I gave them the airline's customer service number. They said, can't you just do it now? I said no. They said, this is why I hate flying. They were booking another flight as they complained. A family showed up with an emotional support peacock once. Yes, a peacock. When we explained it didn't meet the requirements, they said, but we have a letter. I asked to see it. The letter was from an online service and clearly fake. I explained we couldn't accept it. They said, "This is discrimination." I said, "It's policy." They said, "Other airlines let us." I said, "This one doesn't." The peacock made it on social media. They did not make it on the plane. Someone tried to bring a full cooler of food as a carry-on. When we said it was too large, they said, "It's just snacks." I explained it exceeded size limits. They said, "But I need it for the flight." I said they'd have to check it. They said, "It'll spoil." I said, "That's not our problem." They said, "You're being unreasonable." They ended up eating half the food at the gate and throwing the rest away. C. Woman once demanded we call her daughter to confirm her flight details because she didn't have them written down. I explained we can't make personal calls. She said, "Why not?" I said it's not part of our service. She said, "I'm a paying customer." I said that doesn't include personal assistant services. She said, "Young people these days," and walked away. She was 45. Then there was the man who wanted to board early because he was tired. I explained early boarding is for families and priority passengers. He said, "I'm priority." I checked his ticket. He was economy. He said, "I feel like priority." I said, "That's not how it works." He said, "This is discrimination against tired people." He boarded in his group. Someone asked me to watch their bags while they went to the bathroom. I explained we can't watch unattended luggage. They said, "I'll only be a minute." I said it's a security issue. They said, "Fine," and dragged 6 bags into the restroom with them. They were gone 20 minutes. A passenger once complained that their flight wasn't direct. I explained they booked a connecting flight. They said, "Nobody told me." I pulled up their itinerary showing the layover clearly marked. They said, "That's not obvious." I pointed to where it said "one stop" in bold letters. They said, "You should make that bigger." It was the largest text on the page. My coworker dealt with someone who wanted a discount because they didn't use the bathroom on their last flight. They said, "I paid for amenities I didn't use." She explained that's not how tickets work. They said, "It should be." She said, "It's not." They said, "I'm leaving a bad review." She said, "Okay." My last day working at the airport, I thought I'd seen everything. Then a woman approached me asking if she needed a passport to fly to Hawaii. I said yes. She said, "But it's part of America." I said, "You're in Switzerland." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Do I need a passport to get back to America?" I said yes. She said, "From Switzerland?" I said yes. She looked like her whole understanding of geography had just collapsed. She'd somehow thought Switzerland was close enough to America that passports were optional. That same day, a man asked me if his flight to Munich was the same as his flight to Bavaria. I explained Munich is in Bavaria. He said, "So they're the same place?" I said Munich is a city in the region of Bavaria. He said, "Why are there 2 names?" I explained that's how geography works. He said, "That's confusing." I agreed it could be. He said, "You should simplify it." I told him to take it up with the Bavarian government. Another traveler asked me if they needed to learn German to fly through Frankfurt. I said no. They said, "How will I understand the signs?" I explained airports have multilingual signs. They said, "What if I get lost?" I explained staff speak English. They said, "All of them?" I said most. They seemed skeptical. They made their connection just fine. I've worked at airports for 6 years now. I've seen people try to check in for flights that left the day before. I've seen someone try to board with a fishing rod as a personal item. I've watched a woman argue that her purse doesn't count as a bag because she needs it for her wallet. I've explained the difference between AM and PM at least 200 times. I've pointed at signs so obvious a bird could follow them. And here's the thing. These stories never stop. Every day, there's a new confusion, a new assumption, a new moment where someone realizes the world doesn't work the way they thought it did. Sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it's exhausting. Most of the time, it's both. The worst part isn't the confusion, it's the confidence. The absolute certainty that they're right and the entire airport system is wrong. That if something doesn't make sense to them, it must be poorly designed. That convenience is a human right and regulations are just suggestions. But you know what? They all make their flights eventually. Some with seconds to spare, some with hours of buffer they didn't use wisely. But they make it, and then they come back next year with the same questions, the same assumptions, the same shock that Europe isn't a larger version of Disney World. I'm transferring to cargo operations next month. At least luggage doesn't argue with you. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching for laughs. You're observing the deeper truth about how people move through the world. That's what every story here delivers. Subscribing doesn't help me. It helps you not miss the next one. Most people won't get this far. You did. Act accordingly.